I'm specifically interested in how we can understand and investigate also reading and readers through the concept of imagination. And Stephen Cowley and I have recently worked on this, and I'm partly referring to some of our discussions and writings in this talk. And one of the dangers or worries that is often raised, and some of the things that we have discussed is that whether any kind of measurement or description, both qualitative and quantitative, of human behavior and imaginative experience, at least, will somehow reduce the living to something less viable, less dynamic. So the question is, of course, which Bert Hodges also just mentioned in his talk, what are we looking at, and how can we try to get a grip of the phenomenon in useful ways? So first of all, we claim that the standard view of reading as a linguistic decoding problem-solving process is way too simple and partly also wrong. And in fact, we argue that we have scarce knowledge about the reading mechanisms that goes beyond both what we call the functional and the hedonic perspective of reading, such as rule following and problem solving. And one of the main problems with this model is that it treats reading as a sequential and statistical process that basically reduces readers to reading machines. So somehow the experiential basis for reading is left out of this equation. And my concern thus comes from an interest in what you could say is the seemingly mysterious effects that reading entails and which we cannot investigate with the existing models that we have so far. So with the neuropsychologist Stanislas Dehaene, I opened this topic with the question, how are we able to create original universes from reading things like Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita, the tip of tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap a 3 on the teeth, Lolita. So it's really interesting how these graphic traces on a screen or within a book that's being projected onto the reader's retina and touched by the reader's hands can generate these imaginations, how it can evoke different emotions and enable us to read what is not there in the text, basically change our understanding of self and the world. So when reading a text as the one above here, the whole body is engaged and we pay attention to, in this case, the mouth, the tongue, the rhythm with which we read. And you probably all imagine how Lolita feels when it's being vocalized. So this engagement enables us to align ourselves in relation to the text. And that means obviously that reading is not just a mental process used to interpret text and to process information. And second, it also suggests that imagination is already loaded with affective feeling from the beginning. And that's why reading works so strongly on us and why it can change us and change our perspectives. And if we want to learn about human behavior and human experience, we can do that from reading a novel just as much as from taking a class in psychology, for instance, because we learn from emulating how it is to be someone, to be something, or to be somewhere else. And this claim is also warranted by neuroscience that suggests that the same neurological regions of the brain are stimulated by reading about something as by experiencing it. And the neuroscientist Gregory Burns and some of his colleagues have argued, and I quote, the neural changes that we found associated with physical sensation and movement systems suggest that reading a novel can transport you into the body of the protagonist. We already knew that good stories could put you in someone else's shoes in a figurative sense, but now we are seeing that something may also be happening biologically. So that is why I try, together with Stephen Cowley, to emphasize the importance of investigating and also emphasizing reading as a kind of material engagement that fuels imagination. And that requires, we argue, a different starting point than the ones we have available within reading research so far. So there has been this exponential rise in the study of reading, but that does not yet exist a truly interdisciplinary methodology within the field. And the study of reading is firmly divided between, on the one side, experimental research within cognitive and neuroscientific paradigms, and on the other hand, sociological, communicative, perhaps even historical hermeneutic paradigms. And within neuroscience, the focus has to a large extent been on the eye-brain relation, where reading is seen as this problem-solving task of making letter-sound correspondences. And on the other hand, the other side of the scientific reading spectrum, you can say that the brain mechanics have been swapped with embodiment. Um, so the focus lies here on movements, gestures, materiality, and basically epistemologically more observable behaviors and interaction. And we see here how rhythm is important for being in a flow and being focused and maintain power over the activity that's going on. And in turn, both sides of these research spectrum bring forth different kinds of explanations that apply to different timescales. So on the one hand, you have the neural developmental timescale, and on the other hand, you have the microsocial and interactional timescale. Similarly for them is that they both model what happens in real time, either as neurons firing or as movement coordination, basically. But they seem less concerned with constraints on slower timescales. And as I'll show too, reading is very much future oriented. So readers act as these skilled time travelers, you can say, when they engage with the book. And with that perspective, it becomes immensely interesting to ask what material engagement with a book does to us biologically, socially, or personally. Um, obviously, the artifact, in this case, the book, frames, manifests, or even ties imagination to the material engagement, that is the action. And during reading, the reader is constantly reading and writing the narrative. And I think this is really important because, at one hand, they are in it, for instance, as they vocalize the marks on the paper, but they're also composing it and they envision and play with possible and impossible worlds. And in this example, we observe a boy who is imagining life in a giant pear, and shortly after arguing that it must be amazing because your house then also becomes your fridge. And then he resumes to the reading. And the only way for that to happen is if you have some sort of free play in reconstructing the previous experience with real time perception and social rules. So that gives reading an imaginative, a multiscalar, and also a dialogical component. So as we read, we can use imagination to overcome the limitations of the here and now. And we do that all the time as we read. We can see that in the particular cases that we have observed. And there's not much fun in being an unimaginative reader because there's simply no future in it. Or with Bert Hodges' terms, there are no values realizing in it. It's just plain rule following. So imagination is thus is not just an evolutionary byproduct. It is indeed very adaptive because it helps you prepare for what might be coming, like the virtual realities you can create, and it also enables you to develop new, elaborate, and bold perspectives on the world that you're not necessarily experiencing. So, reading is indeed not a silent act, but it's very actional, and that activity also fuels imagination in important ways. But how can we approach that systematically? I don't know if we can, but a starting point here is to propose cognitive ethnography as a framework where we can get knowledge about readers' backgrounds, about the phenomenological experiences, and so on. But we also suggest to trace reading to how they use the sensory motor activity to integrate their understanding with saccading and actual or imagined voices. And this also allows for an understanding of the role of things in reading that hasn't been studied, such as the flow, including the pace, the breaks, the rhythm, the saccading, vocalizing, and so on. And we have observed that in great detail how gesture and voice have these experiential qualities. So, from observation of a literary Danish student reading in German, we learned that she switches between she switches between vocalizing and non-vocal reading. So when we asked why she did it, she answered that the fact that I hear it, the case that it's not just a voice inside my head, but I actually also hear it, allows me to focus my attention. That my thoughts, so to speak, are moved in the background, and I like to use multiple senses in some way too. I think German is awesome. I enjoy speaking it, so therefore it's just cool to read it out loud and hear it, and at the same time feel it in the mouth, how the words kind of feel. And a similar, or not quite similar, but another example that stresses the vocal aspect, the experiential quality of voice, is one that Stephen Cowley and I have been working on, And it kind of reveals, the voice reveals some sort of emotional stances and dialogical skills, for instance, as an ability to emulate not just persons, but more broadly perspectives and emotions, an ability that requires imagination to be on duty, you can say. Um, so from many cases, we choose here one to show the prosodically rich examples in reading. First of all, prosody is unmarked in alphabetic writing, but the boy uses it here in very rich or creative ways, as he kind of projects connotational meaning onto the words that he perceives. His judgments manifest another orientation with Pelinel's words, which we will elaborate. So basically, he orients to moral norms and empathy here. And not only does this other orientation give the reading an aesthetic quality, but it's manifestly axiological and therefore not just functional. So we observe the phonetic shape of the wow in line 1 and his emulation of Kibber's oh yeah in line 4, as well as his vocalizing of Sock's oh no in line 8. And we therefore suggest that merely text-based interpretations of what goes on are shallow. The reader relies on what we call extra textual resources to go beyond the information given. And he does that by linking imagined experience with felt reaction rather than using conventions, for instance, because there are no alphabetic-based evidence for how prosody is articulated. So imagination is a faculty that is constrained by what we know, such as cognition and understanding. And in this example, it involves learned rules and expectations, but it can also be in free play, and that's preconceptual and unconstrained, just like in mind wandering, for instance. And this was something the modern philosopher Kant also underlined. However, after Kant, not many dared to look at imagination until recently, and in the wake, perhaps, of the emergence of embodied cognition, because here researchers started to emphasize how material engagement impact creativity and imagination, not treated like an inner representation that you can study. So think of how musicians, painters, athletes, scientists, craftsmen engage with material artifacts, for instance. So if Kant's idea about the preconceptual judgment as unconstrained engagement with the world is true, then reading purposes, reading strategies are crucial for how material engagement unfolds. And this is really interesting because that is backed up by neuroscience, that the idea here is or correspond to the working of different brain systems. So when people engage in purposeful task performance and act by rote and act rule-following behavior, we can see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is operating full speed, like an editor that narrows down any sensitivity towards perceptions that do not maintain the task-positive network operating. However, when improvising, the prefrontal cortex slows down, the limbic system becomes more active, and more kind of social aspects of cognition can emerge. So, in fact, we see the medial prefrontal cortex becomes more active here. The philosopher Stephen Asma described how a jazz musician who improvises is capable of switching between the task-positive network that relates to planning and decision making and the default mode network that is associated with improvisation. So if in reading we can manipulate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to go quiet, more social kinds of thinking come to the fore. And I argue that this is exactly what we see in the case where the boy reads the novel about the giant pear. So his reading, if we apply a code view, a narrow model of reading, is evaluated as impaired, unfocused, inaccurate, and so on. However, with the more broader perspective, his many pauses, his guesses, misspellings, and gaze wandering, and so on, are signs of how he manages to engage in hybrid cognition, a term that one of my colleagues, Line Simonsen, also uses. So here he draws on a learned code and he engages with possible worlds that in this case involves imagining a life in a pair and probably all the related affective associations that follow such life. So when reading fuels imagination, we observe the anticipations, the projections of a future, and in the less skilled reader, this comes with a price here at the expense of fluency, for instance. So finally here, imagination is always on duty, and the question now is, how much free play can we allow for it to do its work? So in reading, of course, depending on the task, it should be considered how conditions for a sane hybridity of task positive mode and free associations are maintained, basically. So the narrow models of reading emphasize a certain kind of reading, and the danger is that keep readers reenacting kind of rehearsed approaches that does not allow for new perspectives to emerge. For instance, when we see how the untrained readers are so focused on rules that they often lack comprehension, they simply just vocalize and do not know what they read. Whereas skilled readers seem to be good at keeping an open mind, which we can see literally, and at the same time to snap back to alertness when an idea is hatched. So, very little is known about how to get into the flow where ideas can float and more social aspects of thinking can emerge. But the question then becomes, how can we scaffold reading practices so that the material engagement support the reading purposes, whether that might be accuracy, pronunciation, understanding, memory, and so on. And there are many suggestions, but I'll just touch one here, and that is to read books and slow down the reading pace, because reading a book is good for quality imagining because it is rather slow and manual, a manual process. And compared to the task positive modes that we constantly find ourselves in when living in a strongly mediated world, we know that our brain and bodies are affected by the pace and the many demands for attention. So the media works at such a speed that perceiving kind of overrules composing. And coming into flow takes time, both for the brain and the body. And with things at hand, such as a real book, we can control the turn paging pace, we can go back and forth, and all these actions seems to be of value for the reader. And often those embodied aspects of reading are de-learned through education, sometimes impaired through engagement with digital media also. So I suggest to pay much more attention to those rapid dynamics in the slow embodied engagement with books. And by stressing the complex nature of imagination in reading, I suggest that corresponding complex methods should be applied in the study of it. So hopefully I've shown a true interdisciplinary agenda for that here today, and propose that cognitive ethnography could be one starting point.